All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for our HMSC research seminar. I am Mariana Hinojosa, and I am the Special Programs and Course Support Coordinator here at Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, Oregon. I will be your physical host today here in the auditorium, and we have our lovely volunteer Roseanne helping us online. If you have any questions during the presentation, please drop them in the chat and Roseanne will ask them on your behalf at the end of the conversation. And then for those in the room, please raise your hand. I will give you the microphone so we can ask questions and the Zoom folks can hear us. Also, if you haven't signed in, please make sure you sign in on your way out, as well as students, make sure you sign in so you get credit for being attending today. And then we will be recording this event, which I think we are recording currently. Perfect. And so this recording will be available on our past seminars page if you want to watch it again and again and again, as you probably will. We have several announcements before we get to the good stuff today. First, the HMSC Research Summit registration closes on October 14th. If the government is still shut down at that time, on the 16th, the summit will be postponed, but don't let that keep you away from registering now. We also have the AVP update by Dr. Lisa Balance on October 14th at 10 a.m. here in the auditorium. So come find out the new and exciting things that are happening at Hatfield. We also have the Great Shakeout Tsunami Drill on October 16th at 10:16, and we will be going to Safe Haven Hill. So if you want to go for a little walk and practice your tsunami drill, please join us at 10:16 on October 16th. Our next seminar, also on October 16th, it's going to be a busy day. Our next speaker will be Marnie Jo Zibel, here with Hatfield Marine Science Center, and the topic will be an estuary in real time, the coastal monitoring station at Hatfield. Super exciting stuff. And then we also have a Science on Tap coming up at the end of the month on Friday, October 24th. We have Astrid Leitner, the assistant professor with CIOS, the Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences College with Oregon State University, and she'll be talking about Journey into the Deep Sea Mining. So please be sure to join us for all of those exciting things in October. But the reason we're here today is for Dr. Jeff Beeson, an assistant professor at Oregon State University's College of Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences, where he has been a researcher since 2019 and is affiliated with the Cooperative Institute for Marine Ecosystem and Resource Studies, or CIMERS, and NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory. His research focuses on methane seeps, hydrothermal vents, and seafloor volcanism, with a particular emphasis on understanding methane and fluid seepage offshore the Pacific Northwest and in diverse settings around the world. All right, take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you for coming. And as the title says, this talk is going to be about methane and fluid seepage, so methane, the gas, but also the fluids that go along with it sometimes, offshore, particularly offshore Oregon. And what I really like about seeps is they're interdisciplinary in nature, which means I have to bring a lot of friends with me when I study them, which is just a small smattering of their names there and their affiliations, from biologists. A little louder, okay. From biology, chemists, geologists, seismologists, geophysicists. So this takes in kind of a whole holistic view of seeps and kind of how we study them, and in particularly what's happening offshore Oregon. So for those of you who don't know, methane seeps, what are they? So they are low spots on the seafloor that are rich with methane moving through the subsurface and reaching the seafloor, and then at times reaching into the water column. And those can happen in the form of bubbles. Let me see. You can have bubbles coming out of the seafloor. You can have bubbles and oil, so hydrocarbons. So methane is a hydrocarbon. Sometimes these come with higher order hydrocarbons. And then oftentimes you get bubbles and fluid coming out of the seafloor. And these can be coming from we kind of bookcase them into two different zones. They can be shallow biogenic methane, which is from the decomposition of organic matter in the shallow subsurface. But you can also get it from deep in the subsurface, which would be thermally generated. So organic matter that's gone under high temperatures and pressures and cracked that organic matter and made methane or higher order hydrocarbons. And then sometimes we get these really neat things called mud volcanoes, which is not the volcano that erupts lava, but erupts mud and a bunch of material. That's a bunch of really vigorous movement of material from the subsea floor into the seafloor that makes these things that look like volcanoes. So we'll get to look at those in a little bit. All right, so that's what a seep is. Who cares about seeps? Well, the list is actually quite long. There's biologists and ecologists because these seeps generate chemosynthetic communities or habitats on the seafloor that are supported by that methane rich fluid, and that chemical energy supports life and is the basis of a food web that you don't typically get in areas that are below the photic zone. You also have fisheries managers and policymakers are interested in seeps, and that's why I put up here this essential fish habitat on the West Coast. In the latest iteration of the essential fish habitat, methane seeps were put in there as fish habitat. And this is one of our mandated things to consider fish habitat in protecting those areas. The offshore oil and gas industry cares about them because it informs us about hydrocarbons in the subsea floor. Chemical physical oceanographers want to know about the movement of material from the subsea floor in the earth into the ocean and that exchange of compounds. Marine geologists like me are interested about those pathways that fluid seepage can inform us about the structure of our margin. And then obviously, all those organisms that live and depend on them do care about them as well. And I think they're just really neat. Let me see if this gives you a really clear look at why fish habitat. This came from a recent cruise off of Chile, where this is a 5 to 6 meter tall tube worm mound. That's a methane seep that has bubbles coming out of it at the top of it. And you can see these fish that are living in here are cangrejo, which is a commercial fish in Chile. So one of the things we were really excited about this finding was that it seems as if these fish are using the tube worm and the seep as a habitat for their small offspring. You can just see it's rather amazing. When we mapped these, we saw these giant balls in the multibeam on the seafloor data. And when we were like, what are these? And we dove, and they're these massive tube worm mounds being supported by the chemical energy from the seep. Now, I mentioned seafloor data and multibeam. Before we get into the next couple slides, which is how we find them, I'm going to give you something to take away how multibeam works. Multibeam bathymetry, and bathymetry is the shape of the seafloor. And if you learn anything from here, give you a little sense of how we map the seafloor. You have, on the bottom of a lot of research ships, transducers that can send sound and make sound. And they are organized, or they are placed in this thing called a Mills cross. So when I can make sound in one direction, and I can listen for sound in the orthogonal, the perpendicular, I can narrow down to really small spots on the seafloor where, on the surface, where you get reflections back. And we can do that using not just this Mills cross phased array, or Mills cross array, but we use a phase array where I make sound. And let's say this is my transmit array here. And I can radiate noise out. You can see these half circles are sound. Well, if I want to send a bunch of sound in one direction, I can send out all of them at the same time. And I can make a wave front, which is right here. But if I want to move the sound out in angles away, different directions, but I don't want to build something that's swaying back and forth, especially if in the ocean, that will not last very long, I can just delay the timing, and I can send sound out in any direction I want. So I send sound out to all the way to the starboard, to the port, and I listen with that other array in the same perpendicular orientation, and I can map the seafloor really precisely. So how do we use this to find methane seeps? So that's our little multi-beam, how it works. If you take anything away, this is really how a lot of phased arrays work in general. Methane seeps, how do we locate them? Like I said, bathymetry, this is the geomorphology, the shape of the seafloor. If we have this map here, which is colored by depth, where shallow is the warmer colors and deeper is the blue. Just by having this shape of the seafloor, we can see a lot of things. I can see ridges. I can see faults, cuts in the seafloor. And I can see all these hard spots or these rough little isolated areas. But what's also really amazing about seafloor is seafloor backscatter, which is that when I make that sound, when it comes back, I can record how loud the sound was, how much sound returned back to the transducers. And that can give me another data set, which is the reflectivity of the seafloor. And now I see some more things. I've got little red isolated spots of high backscatter that was not super present or visible in just the seafloor bathymetry. So putting those together, we can start to narrow down. Oh, we got a few more spots to look at. But here's the big one. We can take not just the seafloor reflectivity, but all the sound that gets reflected back along the way from the transducer down to the seafloor. We can look at the intensity of that. And that's called water column backscatter. So this is from a paper that me and co-authors wrote a couple of years ago. This gives you a sense of what we're talking about, what I'm talking about with multi-beam. We have these beams going down to the seafloor and bubbles coming out of the seafloor. And we're scanning, kind of like an ultrasound, through the water column. And we can generate these images here that shows the seafloor and then gas bubbles coming through the water column. Here's another view. Then we can take that into three-dimensional view. Let's see if this plays. Nope. So this is, it does not like laser pointer at the same time. There we go. See, that triangle is showing the seafloor moving through, and you see the seafloor as that high reflective zone, and then into view comes this really bright vertical flare. And that bright vertical flare is bubbles that the water column backscatter is picking up, because bubbles are very reflective. Their density is very different than the surrounding water. So they are very bright in our multi-beam water column backscatter. We can look at this in a different way. If we look top down, this is a map view of that same area. And if we play this video, going with depth showing here in that red line moving up, we can see this really bright spot is our methane gas seep and a bunch of smaller bubble plumes around it. We're tracking that through the water column, moving with the currents. And as it gets close to the seafloor, actually particularly at a water depth of about 550 meters, we see the acoustic nature of these bubbles change quite drastically. And I have that highlighted here as GHSZ, which is short for the gas hydrate stability zone. And that's going to come and put a little pin in that. Once we hit the gas hydrate stability zone, the seeps fade very quickly. And then we get near the surface and things get really messy. So that's our kind of geophysical view of bubbles, which is our really fast and efficient way of finding methane seeps on the seafloor. But that's just geophysical view. Let's take a look at what bubbles look like when you get them on camera. And as you maybe haven't got a sense yet, I get quite excited about bubbles. So
Still going.
But yeah, you're right. Oh my gosh. That's been opposite what I was thinking the
Yeah,
whole
let's
time.
put a waypoint down for that.
North.
North.
Yeah.
Okay. Whoa.
Yeah.
No.
Oh my gosh.
Another
Look at the bubbles in the
one.
Oh my
screen.
God,
Bubbles in the screen. It was crazy.
Another waypoint at Nader.
Put all
a
the
colleague
way
of mine.
Oh my
another
gosh.
way-
Look
That
at
is
that.
powerful. Wow.
Holy.
Yeah.
Can we just go down and look at it?
That's cool.
That is so
That is an
That was very lucky in some respects. We knew there was a methane seep from our ship multibeam geophysics view. Then we went down with an ROV and started doing a near seafloor survey and just happened to pick a survey line that went directly through that bubble stream. And we were about 50 meters off the seafloor. And that is a really tight, just really packed window of lots of methane bubbles. Now, if you had looked at those bubbles, if I could have slowed it down and zoomed in, you would have seen those bubbles are actually kind of weird looking. They're not spherical, they're kind of undulating. They got a shine on them. This is where the gas hydrate stability zone comes in. And another way that we look at, we can search for methane seeps, which is with seismic, which is sub-seafloor imaging. So this image here is like a 2D cross section, like a road cut of the seafloor and sub-seafloor, with reflectors indicating sediments and non-reflective things look at as like rock or bedrock. And then we have a very interesting thing that doesn't look really geologic, is this line here. That is known in the seismic world as a BSR, which is a bottom simulating reflector. And that is the base of gas hydrate stability. And gas hydrate is, and I'll put this up so you can start digesting it, is that when you have methane in the presence of water or has available water and it's really cold and it's under pressure, that methane will grab onto some water molecules and freeze like ice, kind of like dry ice. And this map, this little plot, has water, seafloor, and this blue line represents the hydrothermal gradient, which is things getting colder as you get deeper. And then when you hit the seafloor, things start warming up because of the geothermal gradient. You know, the earth is warm, the water is cold. You have this zone that is represented by this green arrow, which is the gas hydrate stability zone. So if you have methane in this zone, it's actually going to turn into ice. And those bubbles, when they reach the seafloor, they immediately get a hydrate coating on them. And that hydrate coating locks in the methane to a degree and protects the bubble. And when the bubble rises outside of this zone, the hydrate coating dissociates, kind of like dry ice sublimates. And you get this, the bubble becomes interacting with the seawater and starts exchanging its gases and then dissolves. So this is what we are seeing when you have methane seeps that are really deep, is that you have them with hydrate coatings on them, which even makes them even more reflective. But what you also have is this BSR, which is indicative of the zone where above this line, you have hydrate in the sediments. And below this line, it's warm enough to where the hydrate is free gas. So you have this boundary between free gas below and methane hydrate above, which becomes a really reflective surface. So this is telling us that there are lots of gas in these sediments. And in this profile, you have this blacked out or wiped out zone here. That's methane punching through and coming up a conduit. And there's a seep at the seafloor here. So if we were mapping with the multibeam, you would see bubbles coming out of this spot. So we use this also to inform us of pathways and how deep the methane or fluids are coming from. Okay? So now you've got a little bit of a crash course in methane seeps, hydrate stability. What about Cascadia? What about offshore Oregon? We have a ton of seeps in Cascadia. A recent paper from one of our Hatfield scientists, recently retired, Murley et al., mapped 3,500 individual bubble plumes, individual methane seeps, similar like the video I showed you. And all here along the coast, you can see them distributed from offshore Vancouver all the way down to Northern California. So there's a lot, and it appears that from her mapping that the feather edge, the upward boundary of hydrate stability, is where we see a lot of seeps, and that's in that 500 to 500 meter water depth. So if we turn that on its side and we look at our offshore Pacific Northwest, all those black dots on there are spots where methane seeps have been identified using multibeam water column data, actively bubbling. And I've mapped out this little this black line, contour line, which is that 550 meter water depth, where the seafloor and the base of hydrate stability are the same spot. So at that area, hydrate is no longer forming in the sediments. It's allowed to be free gas. So that zone ends up being really important for the area where gas can move along below at deeper levels, move up the hydrate stability zone, interact with the seafloor that's above the hydrate stability zone, and release preferentially gas in those spots. Or at least that's what seems to be what the data is telling us right now. So Cascadia subduction zone, why do we have all these seeps here? Let me play that. If you're not familiar, we are sitting on a subduction zone, which is the Juan de Fuca plate subducting underneath North America. And that subduction is accreting material onto North America. The sediments that are offshore that are riding along the Juan de Fuca plate are getting accreted and compressed on our margin. And when that sediment gets accreted, it's full of organic material. Organic material that's coming from productivity in the ocean, from terrigenous materials coming out of our rivers. And that wedge has a lot of organic material that can decompose and turn into methane seeps. And on top of that, because it's compressional and we're a subduction zone, there's also a lot of faults, a lot of fluid migration pathways that can create those natural breaks for the fluid and methane to move along. But what's also kind of neat about Cascadia is that we've had a long history of subduction and accretion of material. And one of the very major players is our most recent accretion of a large igneous province or an ocean island basalt. And this is called the Siletz terrain, named after Siletz in the Siletz people, that we have about 55 million years ago, the ocean island basalt, a really thick material, was emplaced in the offshore, and then through subduction and movement, it was scraped off and accreted onto western part of North America. So you can kind of see that here. This is our coastline, but we have this ocean island basalt accreted and is essentially wedged onto the side of North America, and has been there since and is dictating the margins morphology pretty significantly. So keep note of that the Siletz terrain extends offshore and is thick here, okay? Now apparently, through some recent studies here, actually from people from Oregon State and CIOs, that using magnetotellurics, which is a pretty sophisticated geophysical technique looking at the whole margin, is that they can look at fluids, not just methane, but fluids in the subduction zone. And they used their methods to see that there are these areas of increased fluid storage, and it's being modulated, what they think, by the Siletz terrain. This is a side view of our downgoing plate here, a little cartoon, and this is our Siletzia terrain. And they think, from their fluid storage and their geophysical imaging of the whole region, that Siletzia is acting as this impermeable boundary. That's as those accreted sediments are still accreting and those marine sediments are coming in, they're hitting Siletzia and they're compressing and squeezing the fluid out of the downgoing material. And then because Siletzia is this impermeable basalt, fluids are moving around it. And in this case, they even have, they believe that there's these overhangs of thinner spots of siletzia that are focusing fluid away from going down with the subducting plate, but actually staying in the margin. So fluids are in the system. What about fluids exiting the system? Maybe a few of you have heard of this thing called Pythia's oasis. This made a lot of media stories a couple years ago, that these researchers from UW found an active spring. So they didn't find just bubbles, they found warm water exiting the seafloor, and they called it Pythia's oasis, which was a great name. And it's warm and it's offshore, and they have these chemically distinct fluids that are indicative of really deep migration of water. And here's a little picture of the orifice shooting up, out of the seafloor like a hot spring, which is indicative of overpressured. So you have enough pressure to create an artesian well if this was on land, and it's warm, so it's coming from deep within the subsea floor because of the geothermal gradient. And they think this is coming up along a fault. This is their really idealized model of decompaction of the wedge, and then phase changes, because we won't get into it now, but if you heat up clay will have a phase change and release water. And there'll be particular chemicals in that water that you can look at to tell if it's been a clay reaction, dehydration reaction. But I just want you to take away is that this one seep was found that's showing an observation for that, an observational point that we're in an overpressured system, there's fluid flow moving through, and that we have ways of finding them with the multibeam, and then we have to sample them to find out where is the fluid coming from. Key in the subduction zone, this KC21 project, which I was a part of in 2021, which was collecting high-resolution multi-channel seismic data. So this is deep imaging of the margin to look at how the subduction zone's mechanics work. So keep that in mind. We collected 19 dip lines along the Oregon-California border into offshore Canada. And we'll look at this in a second, but this was a cruise that I'm going to be showing you some data from. They mapped out the Siletz terrain, myself included, and also mapped out the plate interface, so where the subduction is actually happening. And I'll show you just an example of some of the seismic data here. This is an offshore profile in the shelf where we can see the Siletz terrain, the top of it, and the sediment sitting on top of the Siletz terrain, and then areas where we have a sediment décollement, which is where that sediment is getting piled up underneath the Siletz terrain. Okay. We'll get back to seismic profiles in a better venue, for a better format. But in that same year, in that 2021, I also participated in the offshore Oregon with the Nautilus and ROV Hercules. So this was a methane seep-centric cruise using an ROV to go down and collect samples at methane seeps along the margin. Okay, so this is an example of, we used our database of all of our methane seeps, and then we made dives at 11 different areas to collect samples at those seep sites. Yeah, taking an ROV down, which it's a lot harder to get an ROV than to get multibeam data. But if you can kind of see in the distance here, this is another big bubble plume right here that we are about to go sample. Okay, so let's put it together. There's lots of seepage in Cascadia. We have direct observational and collections of a methane seep that's also venting warm fluid, which is Pythia's oasis. we're pretty sure that there's a lot of fluid in Cascadia. But we don't have a lot of ROV direct observations and samplings of methane seeps. And the Siletz terrain is a prominent structural feature that appears to be acting as a barrier to fluid flow offshore. So let's dive through with some fly-throughs to look at these data sets. We'll start here. This is Mary's Peak, also capped with Siletz terrain. And in the distance, you see our Cascade volcanoes. And if we back out, we fly offshore, looking down at our margin, the complex bathymetry. Let's get rid of that. Let's dive into the seismic data and look into the wedge. So these are a subset of those seismic profiles collected in 2021, and I've hung them vertically so we can go and look at them in real space related to the coast. All right, so here in northern Oregon, offshore the Columbia River, which is here, you can see the downgoing plate. This is the Juan de Fuca plate diving underneath North America. These ridges, these tops, this is the seafloor, is accreting. And all that sediment is just getting scraped off and accordioning out. And you can see these ridges are essentially that sediment piling up and not going down with the plate. So it's scraping off all of the sediment. We can look at this next one and you have the same story where you have these nice ridges, downgoing plate. This is the ocean crust, the sediments that sit on top, and then this is the accretionary wedge, all that sediment that did scraped off. If we move south and look at these profiles, you're going to see something kind of starkly different between the sediment going down. Is here, we've changed from northern Oregon, where we have accreted sediments in these ridges, to now no ridges, no clear folds and thrusts. You kind of hit this deformation zone, the deformation front, and things just seem to keep going. So this is telling us that the sediment is actually going down with the downgoing plate. It's stuck on the Juan de Fuca plate and is diving down, or at least in some amount. There's also a whole other story about some large landslides, which take a look at mega slides of offshore Oregon. But it's another talk. You have sediments going down with the downgoing plate. So if we keep moving, get an even closer view. Yeah, so this is off of Bandon, this line. So this line right here, PD 16. And if you can look at my cursor, my pointer, that line is that BSR, the bottom simulating reflector, indicating that there's a lot of gas. Well, there's a strange thing going on right here where it's not really simulating the bottom anymore. It's bulging up. Let me kind of give you a little sense. Turn around a little bit there. Right here. That BSR is deflected to the seafloor. And lo and behold, we found a seep at that spot. From the Langseth data, we saw the BSR using the multibeam on the Langseth, the big research boat. A bubble plume in the multibeam was there. And then we went out, or I did. Fortunately, I was on both cruises within a week of each other, that we dove with the Nautilus and Hercules and mapped this little thing. This little 40-meter mound on the seafloor on the backdrop of this really deep imaging seismic profile where the BSR is bulging to the seafloor is a methane seep. And that methane seep, we mapped it with the ROV, we went down and took samples with push cores and fluid samples. And lo and behold, let me see if this plays. Sped it up for you. That's a temperature probe. So we took its temperature. And you can see that there's bubbles coming out, but there's also shimmery fluid. So this is a warm seep. This is another artesian well warm spring on the seafloor, which is now counting 2 in Cascadia. We have that Pythias oasis. And now we have this one offshore Bandon. And this was with ROV Hercules. I'm still naming it. Pythias oasis, I'm thinking Hercules is hot tub. Because it got up to 17.5 degree temperature fluid in 1,800 meters of water. So this is a really hot piece of a hot fluid. What's going on? Why? Putting the pieces together, but building on why are there hot fluid springs happening offshore Oregon? So yeah, we took samples, we took fluids with a gas tight sampler, we took those push cores. You can see we took actually collected directly the gas here with a funnel. And I won't, because of time, I'm going to go a little bit, that those fluids that were in that seep had the same type of chemical characteristics that Pythias oasis did. Enriched in lithium, enriched in boron, which is indicative of a clay dehydration reactions, and from deep. So we go back to our seismic profile, and now we throw on some interpretations. The downgoing plate here is under thrusting, sending sediment down with it, not accreting. And those sediments are being compressed and dewatered and moving up faults, like these faults, and moving up and getting close to the seafloor. And those fluids are then deflecting the BSR, because now it's the heat from the fluid is causing the hydrate in those sediments to dissociate and release gas. So the gas is coming from the shallow sediments, but the seep is the warm fluid moving up and dissociating those hydrates. And I'll throw something kind of interesting, and this just came in last week. The geophysicist, seismologist, sent me this image of this same seismic line. And this is a velocity model. So this just, without getting too much into it, how fast sound moves, seismic waves move through the profile. Blue is really fast and red is slow. And the blue is indicative of a big, dense piece of material that's stuck in the wedge. And actually, let me kind of superimpose it on my profile. I did my best to stretch it and skew it. Our seep, which is right here, is just on the vertical edge of this body. So it's looking like the downgoing sediment and this vertical body of dense material, dense and fast seismic waves, is causing a conduit, a pathway of fluid to get to the surface. And that's an indicator of why that seep is there, or at least the fluid component of it. So here's where things get a little wild. You'd say, like, well, that little seep, what is that? That's just a little bit of fluid. That doesn't really say too much about the system as a whole. Let's go back to our downward view of our seismic profile, and I'll use my little cursor to show you our little mound where Herc's hot tub is sitting. It's right here. Unbeknownst to me at the time, but there was another cruise happening offshore Southern Oregon within 1 month of us mapping that little guy right there. Mbari was out mapping with their AUVs. And they found this thing. Now let's get a little closer look at it. Okay, my little 40-meter mound is cool. This thing is wild. It's about the size of a football stadium, and it's a crater. And it's got a giant moat around it. Let's get another look at it. So this is bathymetry. This is a crater with even like a resurgent little dome inside of it. Way over here. Actually, go back. Herc's hot tub, this thing. Something is going on in this spot. What is going on? We have this thing that has been described now fairly convincingly as a mud volcano. A lot of material has been moving from the subsea floor to the surface. We found the active one, that bubbling at the warm seep that I showed you. This thing is not bubbling, but it's this huge feature on the seafloor. What is going on here, and how does my little warm seep fall in relation to this thing? And I'll give you what I think is going on, because now we're about hitting the end of, we're hitting the point where Jeff is starting to speculate, and more research is needed. I think this is what's going on. You've got a BSR, you've got sediment with a lot of hydrate, with a lot of gas in it, but it's stable. It's stable because that gas is locked up in the hydrate. If you have a fault that can move warm fluid from deep in the wedge, the subduction zone, to the surface, you're going to perturbate and start dissociating the BSR. And you're going to get this type of system, which is my little mound. You onset dissociation by a young injection of warm fluid. You start to dissociate that hydrate, and you cause a bubbles, and fluid to come out. And you build a little mound. What if you keep doing it? What if you keep having that thermal wave of warm material injecting into the sediments? You're going to get thermal runaway and large amounts of hydrate dissociation all at once. And you're going to get something like this. Runaway hydrate dissociation, lots of gas expansion. You're going to get blisters and bulges on the seafloor. You're going to get material moving up from depth and building out this mud volcano blister crater thing. But at some point, you're going to close up that fault. That fluid conduit's going to move somewhere else. Maybe just a few kilometers away, like mine. And then you're going to get a shell. You're going to get this like skeleton, which is probably what this thing is. It has experienced in the past warm fluid, runaway hydrate dissociation, construction of these features, and then fluid dies down and moves somewhere else. In fact, we see these in other places. Offshore Central Oregon, we have these large dome-like structures, similar with the crater, but then they have another inset crater inside, an inset little volcano inside of it, suggesting maybe it built up, died down, and then reforming with a new injection of warm fluid. I'll give you a sense. Here's our offshore Southern Oregon, Coquille, Bandon, Coos Bay. Our seep is right here with that big feature. Everywhere where there's color here is another mud volcano, like a big thing. And I just kind of will fly down. These are just the large ones that you can see from the regional bathymetry. There's many, many more of these features that are all along the margin. Craters, holes, big pits. And I think it's all related to that warm fluid coming up from accreted sediments, dewatering, pushing up and dissociating hydrate in concentrated spots at periods of time. So here we're back to our view. How does Siletzia play into this? You look at our map here, again with our little black dots. I've added a few lines. I think also we have Siletz terrain acting as a cap. So we don't have many seeps imaged in the shallow waters. We have a few seeps imaged off here, offshore, seaward of Siletz terrain's boundaries. But that Franciscan terrain, which I didn't talk about, but it is a different terrain that's very porous. It's easy to move material through it. I think that Silet's terrain is acting like an impermeable barrier, funneling material, funneling fluid to the shallow subsurface, and then dissociating hydrate and causing these weird features and explaining most of our distribution of seeps offshore Oregon. And I'll give you one more thing here. Here's a view looking down off of, I think, to orient you for your people in, who know Oregon, I think Cape Lookout is right here. They also appear to be coming up on big fault lines. So if I can kind of show you kind of here, there's a big active fault, and there's seeps all along it. And they think that this fault, this is Fulmar and or Albatross fault named by someone recently, is the boundary between Silet's terrain to the east and then accreted sediment to the west. And this is like that suture zone. And seeps seem to be preferentially along it, probably related to fluid movement as well. So Silet's terrain, fluids in Cascadia seem to be a controlling factor where Silet's terrain is, faults, hydrate, all converging into causing these seeps and large features on the seafloor. And I'm gonna, if you want to look at this later, I'll leave it up. You can look at kind of varying things in summary, but it'll be recorded. And with that, I'm gonna say that's kind of the story I've got right now. Thank you. And you can see here, this is one of our ways we sample gas coming out of seeps. Did you catch it? It's going to play on loop. Those are hydrate bubbles. So they're not really gas, they're little ice cubes. And then as we fill up that cone, we suck them up. So we can sample the composition of the gas. Okay, that's what I got.
All right.
418.
Great timing. Perfect. All right. Well, we will start with questions in the room. Anybody in the chat, please drop your questions in there so Roseanne can ask them, but we've got one in the room.
Great talk, Jeff. What kind of timescale are we talking about for the emergence, accumulation, disappearance, perhaps, of a mud volcano?
Great question. The timeline for when that mud volcano, the big one near the warm seep, is unknown of how long ago it is. But we do have an indication for the warm seep is that because the BSR is still visible, you can calculate how long it takes for a particular temperature to have a thermal wave to move and remove the BSR. I haven't done that calculation yet, but Pythia's Oasis did do that calculation, and they suggested in the last 1,500 years that Pythia's Oasis had started deflecting their BSR and removing it. So we're on the like hundreds to thousands timeline for like a new seep to form, and then what it happens between it being the small mound into the big crater, it's unknown. I think we need to look for more intermediate steps because we have the big thing, which is the crater, but it's inactive. And then we have these small mounds that are bubbling and active. We haven't got enough observations of in-between or intermediate steps to look at like what is their evolution through this to that. But my sense is that it can actually happen quite quickly because the more you dissociate the hydrate and you move that thermal wave, you're increasing your available hydrate to dissociate quite quickly because it's like the square law, like it's growing laterally away. So at some point, depending on the conduit of warm fluid, will dictate how wide that thermal anomaly can be. So we don't know.
Quickly to a geologist versus quickly to an ecologist. What are we talking about?
Yeah, probably quickly to a geologist. You could see it in real time. Like you would not, it would be something that's pretty static, I think, for an ecologist. But again, I don't want to prescribe too much because this is still relative. I've only dove on a few of these things. So we don't have a good catalog of data at methane seeps that have the warm fluid and the mud volcano morphology and geophysical data to look at the BSR. Thanks. Great question, though.
Go ahead, Roseanne.
Okay, are there warm seeps in other seafloor areas around the world? And if so, how does their chemical composition compare to the ones you found here?
There are warm seeps at other parts of the world. Now, I will clarify, there's hydrothermal vents, and those are typically related to like magmatic systems, spreading centers. These are different than that. So you do have hydrothermal vents, but you also have these like deep aquifer-esque type systems where they're connected to some geothermal gradient heat source and not a magmatic heat source. The species, the composition is actually quite variable based on the material that the fluid moves through. So while we have our two Oregon seeps now, the Pythias oasis and this warm seep, they're quite similar. You do have varying of what type of rock they're moving through. But there are other warm seeps, artesian well fluids that have been seen elsewhere. I don't have off the top of my head like an example to show to like what the chemical makeup is though, but they do exist.
Questions in the room?
Hi, I'm Alan Neem, got a beaver hat on. Welcome, Beaver.
Go Beavs.
I actually taught in the Department of Geology for 30 years and retired to the Newport area. My specialized area is sedimentology and volcanology of the Oregon Coast Range and the Washington Coast Range and also the Olympic Mountains, where I worked with the U.S. Geological Survey and the State Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. And I also have been over on offshore USGS seismic cruises too, and we've actually published some seismic lines. And I was offshore with Chris Goldfinger a number of years ago, who was a student that I was on his thesis committee, and it was very fascinating because we went down in the Delta.
Yeah.
And we mainly did the shelf area. So we didn't find any seeps, as you said, because it was over Silesia terrain, impermeable cap. I like your story. We did happen to sort of float over the Astoria Canyon.
Oh yeah.
With the Delta, and I asked what was the crush depth, that is when the whole submarine impulsed, and they told me it was 1,200 feet, and we were down 1,000 feet and was starting to make creaky noises. And we didn't want to go that deep, so we decided to come back up. But I noticed along the Astoria Canyon, lots of seeps have been exposed because the canyon is as deep as the Grand Canyon or more. And obviously methane, BSR, dissociation must be happening down in there. And there's some suggesting that's fault controlled.
Yeah.
Worked a little bit with Vern Colm of the Oceanography Department and Parks Navy doing multi-channel seismic over it. But my main concern is, I want to let you aware of, is that in my work on land with geology, which continues to this day with the U.S. Geological Survey, after I retired from OSU, it involved mapping subduction zones in the Olympic Mountains, where we have a number of seeps going up from the accretionary wedge of the Ho and also Eocene older formations on the Farallon Plate. And some of those gas seeps were thermogenic. They were hot.
Yeah.
You know, the organic matter based on carbon isotopes was made into thermogenic methane. And it was related to subduction and actually flowed up through, in the Olympics, through the impermeable basalt cap. And we actually sampled the 4-rock sediments above it. And sure enough, it was thermogenic gas coming out of little mounds and from mudstones and things. Southern Oregon, we also wrote a paper on, it's a subduction zone, that's paleo subduction zone, not the active subduction zone. And again, in that paper, I worked with a geochemist named Keith Kinvoven of the U.S. Geological Survey. And we actually sampled a lot of water wells, and it was, again, an accretionary margin with thrust faults. And a lot of the gas, we were getting lots of gas heaps, which we published on, that are through the old Eocene rocks down there. That's thermogenic, and some of them are very active. And so I just want to let you know that there's still bubbling natural gas on the surface. And with Chris Goldfinger, we did some high resolution seismic down there, and Chris actually went into one of those craters where it was bubbling like crazy. And I assume you must know about this.
Yeah.
He was braver than I was, but he said it was very fascinating. We do have onshore mud volcanoes up in the Olympic coastal area.
Yeah.
And I've actually gone into a mud volcano up there. So there's some on land examples in the accretionary wedges, but it's essentially an active one because there's a lot of methane on it. So I just want to let you know some background. We need to talk a little bit more. Fascinating talk. And I'm very happy to see that you've come a long way into understanding the seeps. In addition, I have also mapped several tertiary age carbonate mounds and seeps with chemosynthetic fauna in the Coast Range itself.
Wow.
So if you ever want a field trip,
Yes.
this is a great place to go to see what it looks like in the geologic record. And again, it's a similar geologic setting, but it is the fore rock. The sediments are not deformed like the accretionary wedge. But the bubbles are deep faults that come up to the surface. So any estimate you think of how much natural gas is being released by these 350 gas seeps offshore and causing climate warming or not? It hasn't been accounted for in climate models. That's all.
Thank you very much for that. Chris Goldfinger is my PhD advisor. So yes, I've heard many of those stories, and I'll comment before about the estimate. Astoria Canyon is wild. At the bottom of Astoria Canyon has massive hydrate boulders, like ice cube or ice sitting on the seafloor that will periodically detach and float to the surface. Those ROV dives have gone back a couple times, and what was a ice cube buried in the sediment, hydrate ice, one year is gone, and it's just a giant hole in a year or two later. And they're all bubbling quite a lot extensively. Hydrate, and it's likely because of the down cutting and exposing the hydrate in the sediments. As for the on land stuff, that is really fascinating because the story doesn't stop at the coastline. It's just you have different ways to get to them. So I'd love to talk to you about that because there's some work down in southern Oregon off of Bandon near the Blanco fracture zone that actually has a helium anomaly associated with a gas seep that suggests it's also really deep, mantle connected. So yeah, we should talk some more about that. Now for budget estimates of methane into the atmosphere, this is something we get asked a lot. A lot of that methane is taken up by the ocean, by oxidized. It has a lot of time, and the ocean is really good at taking it up. Now, what we don't know is the shallow seeps, which if this impermeable Silet's cap is actually doing it, it's maybe blocking a lot of the shallow seeps that would get into the atmosphere. This is why Hecate Bank is really interesting, because it's really shallow, and there's lots of seeps on Hecate Bank. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing to point out about BSR, I was on a cruise with deep sea drilling off of Baja, California. It is by Yates. And we did deep sea drilling, and we saw the BSR on our line. We didn't understand what it was. And at that time, off of Southern California, we thought that reflector actually was related to a diagenesis change from sediment to sediment rock. But with your work here, I'm not so sure.
Well, BSR was something that like active source reflection seismologists were really puzzled by until they coupled it with drilling, that it's actually quite dangerous if you are drilling into a BSR because it's overpressured and gas. So a lot of industry drilling is trying to get away from BSR. But yeah, thank you. Yeah. A lot of gas. Yeah. really smelly.
Yes. All
Thanks,
right.
Al.
To respect everybody's time, I think we have one more question online and then
Yeah, this is a multi answer. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Was injecting warm fluid part of your research or a natural process? I'm new to this area of research. That's part one.
Part one is no, it wasn't. I wasn't doing the injection myself, but it was in the continuum of trying to understand why we have methane seeps where they are and explaining the distribution of seeps and these features on the seafloor kind of led to this fluid story as well.
Okay, part two, is it possible to test your conceptual model about how the large mud volcanoes are formed in a laboratory setting?
Probably not, but what's great for me, I'm not a big, scale model type person. I like going and finding the physical, real world model and looking at them in situ, like in go just explore a bunch of them. But it's hard to make hydrate. You need a lot of cold and pressure, and it's methane, which is not a great gas to work with on the surface.
Okay, and finally, part
Yes.
part three, how long after seeps appear do ecosystems form around them?
I don't really know, but those seeps in Chile are actually quite interesting, those big tube-worn mounds that I showed at the beginning, because there's some indications from the sediment cores we took around them that there's sheet flows of sand from large earthquakes that very well could just be burying them periodically. Chile has a lot of earthquakes where they get destabilized and seem to grow back rather quickly, maybe on the ecologist's time scale pretty quickly. So I think it's unknown, but my sense would be pretty fast.
All right, great. Well, let's give Dr. Jeff Beeson one more round of applause. Thank you for your time today. And I believe he'll be hanging out for a couple of minutes if you have questions.
I'll be here.
So come on down and chat with him. And thank you again for coming. And we'll see you next week.
I will disconnect here though.